Want to see how we create our Black Agate design for our epoxy countertops? Stay tuned. Okay, let's get started. What we've done is apply 1 ounce per square foot of alloy just for a skim coat before we start the pour. Okay, so what I'm doing now is I am creating the exotic pour buckets for all the counters in this kitchen. I like to use between 7 to 8 ounces per square foot on my exotic pours. So on this one I mixed up 448 ounces total. I used 184 ounces of alloy, 224 ounces of white alumilite dye, and 40 ounces of black alumilite dye. Now, as you can see, I am randomly putting these colors in, no rhyme or reason, not even a certain amount in each bucket. And between the layers, I'm using white spray paint to create some really awesome selling effects. Now, here's a pro tip. I don't mix up all of my buckets at one time, so I have plenty of epoxy left over. And the reason I do this is to make sure that I'm happy with the colors as they're pouring out. Just like in natural stone, there are some areas that are darker and some that are lighter, so I mix my buckets the same way to create variety. I like to use 32 ounce buckets when I'm doing my exotic pours because I feel like when I use larger buckets, too much material comes out at one time and I don't have enough at the end. The key to the way that I do my exotic pours is pouring in different directions and varying the colors in between my buckets. So as you can see, I pour from my lighter buckets and then I go in with my darker buckets. And I continue to alternate and fill in all of the empty spaces. Now sometimes I will work on all of the counters at the same time, pouring a little bit from each bucket so that way there is a continuity of the color. And other times I'll finish one and then continue on to the next counter. It really just depends on the size of the kitchen and the counters themselves. Here I noticed that the colors all started to look the same in this area, so I added a little bit more darkness in my buckets and came back over those areas with those darker colors. Another pro tip is don't over torch an exotic pour or you will lose your design. The more heat you give it, the more it's going to move. So I'm just doing a really light torch just to pop the air bubbles. I did all the big counters first just to get them out of the way, and I'm finishing up with the small side counter. Now check out how cool an effect you get when you spray paint right on the top of your bucket. It's been about 45 minutes or so, and I'm taking clear alcohol in my hand and creating some big drops of it throughout the entire surface. And as you can see, it fractures the colors that are on there and really makes it look like natural stone. But you gotta give it some time to work, so don't worry, let it work, then go back and touch anything you don't like. You can also take what's on your fingers and just flick it, and the alcohol will create smaller circles versus the larger drops. You can also spray it straight from your bottle, but I prefer to do it by hand. I feel like it gives me a little more control over how much is going on and where it's going on. Now we used Stone Coat's Art Coat because this has mostly white in the design and it has a longer working time. So I find that I can actually work it for a good hour and a half, sometimes even 2 hours. So I like to pull the tape closer to the 1.5 hour mark to allow the epoxy to drip over the edges and the design to continue over. After I pull the tape, I do a really quick torch just to warm it up a bit and help everything flow over the edges. But again, not too much heat. Anywhere where it's having trouble flowing, just take some of your table epoxy like I'm doing here and push it up into those empty voids and it will help the epoxy flow down. Now this is my favorite part. After the epoxy has set up for quite some time, 2, maybe 3 hours, you can see it's pretty thick. I put some spray paint on the table into the table drippings and I scoop it up with my paint stick and I put this anywhere that could use some additional interest, especially the fronts of sinks because it's so narrow. The design sometimes has a hard time holding. So by doing this and having it be so set up, it'll ensure that it holds and creates some really cool effects once you torch it. An alternate way to get some effects is take a little bit of that table drippings and put it into a bucket, then spray paint, add some more table drippings, give it maybe a half a stir if you need to, continue to throw more of that epoxy into the bucket and then continue to add effects from the bucket. And here's the final results.